So I'm a little stressed. And so a couple of years ago, I heard this lady being interviewed on the radio. She was an author, and towards the end of the talk, the interviewer said, "Are you nervous when you speak?" And she said, "I'm nervous until the subject takes over." And I have the same thing. Now, many of my talks about Lyme disease, and I'm very familiar in that, and at a certain moment, the subject just takes over, and then you just talk. And of course, this is a subject that we're all very familiar with. So I'm going to talk for about 10, 15 minutes, talk a little bit about some physiologic and some little bit of statistics and some physiologic issues. And then Dr. Moore will take over, and he looks at it more from a, psychological therapeutic standpoint. Yeah. So, some of these statistics, when I start looking and giving a talk about this, they're kind of overwhelming, and it turns out that about 75 to 90% of all visits to the doctor are related in some way to stress. That seems kind of bizarre, 90%. And when you see all the things that people go to the doctor to is fatigue and pain and anxiety and insomnia and high blood pressure and irritable bowel, and it goes on and on and on. And, they're all aggravated by stress. By the way, these slides are on a handout in your, that you got. So this is actually, to me, that was very surprising. And when you look at some of the things that cause stress, these are things that we're all very familiar with. Job pressure, money plays a huge role in stress. And what we see a lot is people that are chronically ill. We see a lot of chronic ill people here in the office, and that creates a lot of stress, and stress contributes to it. And we're going to go into that later. Relationships play a big role, and we see that in the office often here when a person is chronically ill, especially in the way they present to us, and they've been to many, many doctors, that often the people around them just don't understand it because the person looks good, and the doctors can't find anything, and then the people around them, they don't understand it, and it creates a lot of stress for people. Poor nutrition, our physical health plays a role, and something that's really burdening my heart really is, I call it media overload. I'm very concerned about our young people. Even the little children get overwhelmed by data and impressions. A couple of weeks ago, I have a 3-year-old grandson, and my daughter-in-law was with my grandson visiting, and she said he wants to read the same book 20 times. And I thought, I remember when I was a kid, you'd look in the same book all the time. I mean, first we didn't have a lot of books, but then you could look at the same pictures all the time. And what we realized that what is important for the development of our brain, that's important. And now we have a generation of kids that constantly get overwhelmed on these devices. It's high intensity, and so their brains don't even get the chance to develop. And so it's not surprising that we see so many young people with anxiety, suicidal ideations, poor self-image, things like that. And I think some of that is triggered by the media and the social media. And then sleep plays a big role. Here are some of the percentages of symptoms. People feel physical symptoms in 3/4, from stress, psychological symptoms. And, and then there's even that 1/3 of the people, they feel that they live with extreme stress. That's quite intense. And then also that it's constantly increasing. I think some of it is increasing because as we age, we have less ability to deal with stress. Some impact statistics here, does it affect our personal and professional life? Half the people, they say yes. And it has an effect on work and family and etc. I'm not going to name all these up, they're in your handout, but it's really very impressive, and it costs a lot of money. And you see the physical symptoms. People have fatigue, headaches, upset stomach, muscle tension, appetite, teeth grinding. These are all very common symptoms that many of you probably have, and I sometimes have them too. And then the emotional things, people have anger, they're nervous, they are tired all the time. And you know, in one way, what stress really does, stress makes us not be who we are. You know, one time I heard it comment, it costs a lot of energy to try to be something different than what you are. You know, and stress evokes that in people. So what is the definition of stress? You know, stress is a mismatch, yeah, of what we perceive we have to do and what we think we can do. So it doesn't match up. Yeah, so you're afraid of failing, of being judged, of being rejected. And you know, that really describes it a lot, whether that stress is physical, emotional, or mental. Yeah, and it's different. There's a difference between stress and being challenged. You know, so for example, I was a little stressed doing this talk, but I know it's going to turn out okay. That doesn't really, you know, I didn't lay awake from it, but I'm a little uptight and stressed, but I think I'm going to be okay. So that is a different thing that when I sit here and I would be standing here and I wouldn't know what I was going to talk about and thinking, what are these people going to think of me? So that would be a whole different picture, and then that would create a lot of stress. So there are many forms of stress. You know, there's of course the physical stress. You know, we get injuries, head trauma, surgeries, accidents, all those kind of things. We experience stress in our body. And under the heading chemical stress, you know, we get exposure to chemicals, toxins, and I also included infections, trouble for our body to get rid of toxins. And one thing I added to that too is the disturbance of day-night rhythms. And that's another thing that we see in the last 10, 15 years a lot, especially with LED lights. You know, first, you know, we're constantly on these devices day and night. You know, it used to be that when I was growing up, you didn't call anybody after 8 p.m., you know, and you didn't call somebody before 8 a.m. Yeah, you respected people's days, nights rhythms. And, you know, that is all gone with these devices. I mean, people text you at 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, I don't, you know, my phone is off, but my kids' phones are not off. And on top of that, what turns out that artificial light, and especially LED lights, they suppress melatonin levels. There are actually associations between having much exposure to LED lights, which is very high in blue light, and various cancers, prostate cancer, breast cancer. These are all very real things. And you know, and that on top of that creates a stress when we don't have good day-night rhythms. Of course, mental stress, we get overwhelmed with data, yeah, too much information. And one thing that's the consequence of that is that we actually lose the ability to think deeply about things. There's so much information. It comes so fast. You know, you see actually even journalists, it's very hard. They don't get the time anymore to think something over and to write a thoughtful article, because if they wait a half a day, it's already out there and nobody wants the article anymore. So it's very interesting how that creates an enormous pressure. And then there's, of course, the emotional stress, you know, the ongoing events, and then on top of that, past trauma and habits we have formed because of stress that create problems in the here and now. So our ability to deal with that is really affected by a lot of things. One is our physical health. We see a lot of people here, everything has become stressful. And I find often that their adrenals are worn out, they are in pain. And I always use this little example, you know, that stress is a relative thing. So say if I get up in the morning and, you know, I'm feeling good and I'm coming to my car and I want to open my car and I drop my keys. You know, and I just pick this up. I might be at the most a little annoyed. Is that stressful? I wouldn't say so. So now I didn't sleep well last night, and my back is hurting. And I come to my car, and I drop my keys, and I go, that's stressful. So that same event of dropping my keys suddenly becomes stressful. And what we see that when people get more and more sick, and they get weaker and more tired, that everything becomes stressful. Every little thing. You smell the wrong smell. You don't sleep as well. Somebody says the wrong word. You eat the wrong thing. It doesn't really matter anymore. And then you see the stress piling up, and it has to do with the inability to process it and cope with it. And you know, these things depend on our physical health and our age, and of course also with life experience and whether we get taught techniques to cope with it. You know, we can develop skills, and Dr. Moore is going to talk about some of those, that we can develop skills that help us deal with the stress so they don't affect us in that way. And the other thing is, I write also the sense of self is really very important. I think a lot of traumatic experiences as children can very much affect who we are and how we interact with the world. So stress is a two-edged sword. You know, stress can create illness, and illness creates stress. And that it's a little bit what I mentioned earlier. You know, when you're tired and achy, you know, anything you do is stressful. So how does stress manifest in the body? It's to a part of our nervous system that we don't have control over, at least not in a conscious way. You know, if I want to, you know, move my arm, I make a decision somewhere and I move my arm. Well, it's part of our nervous system that regulates our heart rate and our digestion and whether our pupils narrow and whether we sleep, our day-night rhythms. It's called the autonomic nervous system. And that autonomic nervous system has two big parts. You know, one is called the sympathetic and the other one called the parasympathetic. And just to make it simple, the sympathetic nervous system means the foot is on the gas. And the parasympathetic means the foot is on the brake. And the problem is with chronic stress that your foot is always on the gas. And we can't stop it. Yeah? And when that happens, all kind of physiologic things starts happening. You know, our heart rate goes up, cholesterol goes up. You know, to me, many years ago when I learned that if you go to the lab for a fasting cholesterol level and you get in a near car accident, your cholesterol shoots up just because of that event. And then your doctor say, wow, your cholesterol is up, and he puts you on a medication. While it may just be that you had just a stressful event. The same thing, I mean, I have people, they come here, and every time they come in, their blood pressure's up. And I don't even wear a white coat. But when they, you know, when they just get stressed out by that, again, so the cortisol goes up, the adrenaline, we get increased insulin resistance too, yeah? So it can affect your blood sugar, inflammation, so all of these things. So, you know, when you look at, in an average, you know, doctor's practice, what kind of drugs do they write for? You know, we get blood thinners. Stress makes the blood more sticky. Yeah? We get cholesterol drugs, diabetic drugs, sleeping pills, muscle relaxants, anxiety medication, anti-inflammatory. Well, that covers about probably 90% of the prescriptions the doctors write, and they're all related to stress. So that is really a very interesting thing, you know. And so this is a little bit where you said of the adverse childhood experiences. Recently, research has really showed that when you have really adverse life experiences early on, that can actually affect your immune system for the rest of your life. And that is very intense, you know, because what we're running into here often, that people come and have all these chronic problems. And, you know, what happened to them in the past definitely plays a role. You know, I've seen many people had bad things happen, and it affects their immunity. Now, that doesn't mean that cannot be reversed. But often, people just don't even want to go there. By the time they walk in here, and I would bring that up, it's like, well, another person who says it's all in my head. You know, so you got to be really careful, you know, and get a really good relationship with people that you say, well, wow, there may be things that might be constantly, you know, now that you're a little better, that prevents you from getting, you know, more better. There's a great book here, it was just published, called The Deepest Well, that they actually seen that childhood adverse experiences can, you know, affect growth rates, diabetes, asthma, heart disease, and all of those kind of things. So that is, again, I just said that, you know, both present and past trauma plays a role. You know, so that is something that I find as I work with people, you can't ignore it. You know, it has to, on a certain moment, you have to pay attention to it. And again, this is like, you have to be really careful, you know, how you bring that. But on the other hand, I find also that when people come in and their adrenals are worn out and they're not sleeping and they're hurting all the time, there's no room to deal with emotional and stress issues. You know, that is what it is. People think that's all in their head. So this is a little diagram, and I put a copy of that in the handout, just some issues that I find affect chronic illness. Because chronic illness is never caused by one thing. And that's the problem. In conventional medicine, we always look for the thing, the bug, the problem that causes it, the allergy. And why we have so many diagnoses that are fuzzy and vague, like chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and irritable bowel and PMS. And they're really names for a bunch of symptoms that the doctors really don't know what causes it, because it's never one thing, it's always a complex issue. And so it's a whole different way of approaching that when you want to help people with that. You know, and when you look at that diagram, there are 4 of them, you know, that really have to do with stress and emotional issue. One is the excessive chronic stress. Then I look here at the light pollution and the day-night disturbances, dysfunctional relationship, and disrupted biorhythms. They all have to do with, you know, this whole stress emotional picture.